Economic globalization. So, in this chapter, we're going to be thinking about a time after the reservation system has been put in place and after colonial governments had already started doing the cultural modification policies we talked about before. And so, in this chapter, we're going to be looking at how colonial governments attempted to economically develop tribal or indigenous societies within their borders. And through these economic policies, the colonial governments attempted to bring the indigenous societies within the larger capitalist world order. But indigenous people were often resistant to this economic integration. This is because they had their own economic systems already in place with their own values and rewards and weren't necessarily interested in working for foreign material objects. And so the colonial governments were forced to use a whole variety of strategies in order to integrate these indigenous and small scale societies within the larger global economy. And so, first up, we're going to have Gabrielle tell us a little bit more about the different ways the colonial governments tried to integrate small scale societies within the larger economy.
Hi, everyone. So, today we're going to talk about economic globalization and how this affected the native and indigenous peoples. So, to start off, you first have to understand that indigenous peoples had their own way of economic exchange. So, a lot of them were subsistence based off subsistence. So, which means that they farmed, they made goods, and so they traded with one another. However, when colonialism came about, this economic system no longer fit with the colonist ideal of lifestyle. So what happens? Well, indigenous peoples kind of start becoming out of place, meaning that their systems no longer were allowed. And so this being, they were forced into an economic standpoint and system that no longer fit their lifestyles nor their cultural beliefs. So what happens? Well, the government turns to slavery. So you look and you'll see the triangle trade. The British start putting annual work periods in. The Dutch offer 2 months of labor work per year. The Germans start blackbirding or kidnapping labor. So they'll kidnap you and then they make you forced work labor for different items and things in different locations. But what we basically see is that a lot of forced labor came about. It wasn't an equal opportunity economic system. It was forced work and a takeover of how much could we get from you without giving much. And so with the Spanish, they did the encomienda system, which is basically slavery. And so you see that the basic labor system that's put in place is just a professional name of slavery or working for free. So with this forced labor, you see a lot of people being punished. So if you didn't want to work, there were a lot of negative punishments and side effects of this, whether they were beatings, whether they were starvation. A lot of negative behaviors came from this, and this caused a lot of issues over the years, not just to one group of indigenous people, but many indigenous peoples around the world are having this issue and still have this issue pop up time to time of forced economic change. So, well, what happens now? Well, they force you to pay taxes. Now that the forced labor was stopped, indigenous peoples were pushed into a whole nother game and ball game, which was forced taxes and discipline. Well, now we're not going to make you work. However, we're going to taxate you. We're going to give you all of these random taxes. We're going to force you to pay any income and economic gains that you have back to us. So what does that mean? Now, these indigenous groups are now being forced to pay for schools. Before, schools were free for students to go to and learn about being of the people and the society and the changes that are required and to become a well-rounded member of society. However, now you see these indigenous peoples being forced to pay for their children to be able to go to these schools and get decent educations. You also see a lot of sidestepping when it comes to things that are considered taxes. So you get like the head tax or the poll tax, which also demanded 2 months of labor. And you also get a lot of only payable in cash. So you can't pay me in any type of good. So if you had a hand weaved blanket, that's not good enough as a form of payment. You now have to find a way to pay me in cash, which then was a force of entrapment. Because at the end of the day, who has the cash? Well, you have to go back into working forced labor, basically. It's a way to force you back into the systematics of forced labor because you need that cash for this economic system. So they basically also created an artificial need for money. So in order for you to need money, we have to give you things or create things in order for you to want those things. So you see a lot of pop-ups of like alcohol, you see a lot of pop-ups of different types of clothing, weapons, things that were enticing enough to make you want to have cash in order to buy them. You also see it keeps being pushed and forced into paying for education, paying for the basic necessities, and things started to be switched over into economic gain in order to force them into using cash and change their economic system within their cultural norm. And so you really have to pay attention to this because this is the colonial government. Their biggest thing is to make it to benefit them and not the indigenous people. And so this now translates into the economic system we currently have, not just in the United States, but throughout the world in different colonial and different colonies. If you actually look at certain colonies, these financial and economic systems are still very prevalent to the current day society. And this is an issue in which you really have to take in two parts. This is the beginning of the system where we're understanding that this was a forced migration and movement into the system. Now we have to also look at what the other side will bring on the other side of now becoming an economic system and how that's going to affect down the road. So for now, this is how this forced labor and this implements of taxes is put into place on the economic globalization of the indigenous peoples.
Thanks, Gabrielle, for that great explanation. And one major way that colonial governments attempted to integrate indigenous and small-scale societies was through forced labor. And we see this pattern in colonial governments all around the world. And although it takes on many different forms, the underlying themes are the same. For instance, both the British and Dutch had periods in the year where indigenous people had to work for the colonial government. And this forced labor was seen as their obligation for the colonial societies to bring them civilization. In the Pacific, we see a pattern known as blackbirding, which we talked about already, in which German and Australian plantations kidnapped people from Micronesia and brought them to the plantation against their will. Elsewhere in Africa, we see a French decree in 1926 that African people had to work for 3 years for the colonial government. And in the Congo in 1903, they decreed that each person had 40 hours of labor that they had to give to the colonial government every year. In North America, we see forced labor through the hacienda system through the Spanish colonies, and most famously the triangle trade between Africa, Europe, and North America, in which millions of slaves were brought across the ocean and forced to work on plantations. And even when colonial governments were forced to stop using indigenous labor, they used other means of economic coercion to force indigenous people to engage with the economic systems of capitalism. And these included taxation on things like poll tax when you voted, head taxes for people in a family, and even dog taxes for the number of animals that a family owned. One of the major problems with the taxation system of colonial governments was that they are only payable in cash. And this was a major problem because oftentimes in indigenous societies before colonization, there wasn't much cash circulating around, and many people bartered for what they needed, which is trading goods for other goods. And so for these people to pay their taxes, indigenous communities often had to engage in cash cropping, in which they grew crops for the market, or through selling their labor to outside companies and plantations. And so in many ways, the taxation system brought by colonial governments created an artificial need for money in these societies. And when cash taxes weren't enough to bring indigenous people within the colonial economy, the colonial governments often created laws that allowed corporal punishments and beatings for people who failed to pay their obligations. Another major form of cash outlay for indigenous people is education, especially as colonial governments charged large amounts to send children to school. And over time, the schooling requirements increase, so that children who once had to go to 6th grade now have to go to high school and eventually college, forcing themselves and their families to engage in larger and larger outlays of cash. Another way that colonial governments attempted to integrate small-scale societies within the global capitalist order was through creating progressive consumers. One of the biggest problems that colonial governments faced when integrating indigenous groups was that they were very self-sufficient and didn't need a lot of things from the outside economy. And so the colonial governments decided to create commercial demand for their products in order to stimulate the economy. And they used a variety of factors to create this need, including forced labor, depopulation, reducing the local land base, loss of indigenous food sources, and taxation. And all these factors together created the need for commercial goods rather than locally produced ones. Another way that colonial governments attempted to create good progressive consumers in small scale society was by promoting technological change. Many colonial powers wanted to replace indigenous crops, livestock, and agricultural techniques with their own supposedly superior versions. And these new technologies not only required an abandonment of self sufficient practices that indigenous and small scale societies used, but also created a greater reliance on global economies. And the introduction of cash crops often meant that indigenous people must rely on others for food rather than producing it themselves. And so, in many cases, indigenous people had to weigh the benefits and cost of technological change versus the loss of reliable subsistence practices. While incentives towards greater economic integration, such as taxation and forced labor, were largely abandoned during the early part of the 20th century, colonial and post colonial governments in the mid 20th century turned to new avenues to integrate small scale societies. So, following World War II, colonial powers began to focus on the rapid economic growth of small scale societies, especially in the context of the Cold War. And this was seen as a way to keep third world countries from going communist and following the Soviet Union rather than following the British and American model of capitalism. In these neo-colonial plans, indigenous people were often viewed as obstacles to the economic growth of these countries, and outside experts were brought in to help grow the indigenous economies. And so, one of the most successful ways that post colonial governments attempted to bring indigenous and small scale societies into the larger global economy was through tourism. And while the overall goal of tourism was to create jobs for the local economy, in many cases, this resulted in exploitation of indigenous territory and culture as an exotic tourist attraction, as well as a symbol of national identity. In these situations, the tourism often benefits special interest groups rather than the indigenous people, because the indigenous people have little to no direct control of the tourist trade, and they can't really set the prices of what they charge. And so, because they have little control over it, indigenous people only get a marginal amount of money that's brought in via tourism. And while many of the effects can be negative, not all of them are. And they're one of the few ways that indigenous societies are able to earn income for themselves to support their local economic development. But despite tourism often being run by outsiders, in recent years this is changing. And in many indigenous societies, tourism is now controlled by local people, including local tour guides and managers who help to set the expectations of outsiders and allow them to understand cultures within a meaningful way. And so, for the remainder of this video, we're going to take a look at 3 different case studies in which colonial governments attempted to bring small scale societies into the global economy. And we'll also take a look at what are some of the unintended consequences of these programs. So, first up, we're going to take a look at the Dutch colonial projects in what is today Indonesia. And in particular, we're going to take a look at the Tortugas people on the island of Sulawesi. In 1892, the Dutch colonists deemed the Tortugas as incapable of progress without their help, and they saw the Tortugas' small-scale methods as backwards and against the development of progress. But despite early missionary work in the area which sought to bring economic development, these early missions failed, and by 1905, the Netherlands Indies government brought administrative control to the area using armed forces. And the violence brought by these armed conflicts drove the Tortugas towards the missionaries, and many were converted. Over time, the Tortugas grew cash crops and became reliant on the world economy at the loss of their own self-sufficiency. And we can see a similar pattern of economic integration projects by colonial governments in Africa. In particular, we're going to take a look at what today is South Sudan and the Azande Development Scheme. Within this region, the Azande were a small-scale indigenous society of cultivators and hunters who lived in the region long before contact. Their largely self-sufficient way of life was disrupted in 1905 by British attacks seeking to bring law and order to the region. And just like we talked about in our chapter on wars and raids, these conflicts terminated Azande political autonomy, and they were followed by attacks on their subsistence patterns as well. In 1911, the civic administration of the British colonial government moved the entire Azande population alongside of roads in order to use indigenous labor to facilitate administration. And in the interest of conserving the environment, the Azande were forbidden by the colonial government to use their favored subsistence practices and locations, as well as indigenous hunting practices and techniques. And the need for cash was compounded in 1920 when the British government implemented a head tax on the Azande. But despite these changes, until the early 20th century, the Azande still remained largely self-sufficient. And this changed only in the 1930s when large-scale cash cropping of cotton was introduced into the region. In the 1940s, new Azande development schemes were recommended, and an industrial complex for cash crops was set up with more than 1,500 Azande employees. And within this scheme, every man within Azande society was forced to work at least 1 month a year on the project. Not only did this project disrupt Azande labor patterns, but it also disrupted their land tenure system as well. And in this development project, more than 170,000 Azandes were displaced from their lands in order to make room for new cotton growing operations. Due to all these projects, the economic outlook for the Azande had improved throughout the late 20th century. And by the 1960s, a report showed an increased use of sugar, no naked people left, women dressing fashionably, everyone having bicycles, and all the people having clean houses with beds and mattresses as tangible signs of economic progress. But despite these benefits, new economic projects also contain the seeds of their own downfall. And the post-colonial government's treatment of the Azande people sparked a civil war, which lasted on and off from 1955 to 2005 with the signing of the peace accords and the creation of the new government of South Sudan. And for our last case study today, we're going to take a look at the Pacific, and especially the purchasing progress as well as dependency in Micronesia. Unlike some of the other places we discussed in this chapter, Micronesia's transformations towards economic integration was accomplished largely without coercion. And the colonial government used lavish rewards and massive spending programs on education, administration, and special development projects to integrate the people into the global economy. And this large-scale economic integration of the Micronesian people by the United States colonial government came after the Japanese people had formerly controlled the island. Between 1914 and 1946, the Japanese Empire administered the island and used traditional colonial methods such as cultural suppression, giving the best land to colonists, and cash cropping in order to control the local populations. But following the end of World War II, the area came under the control of first the U.S. Navy and later the U.S. Department of the Interior. These projects sought to bring new economic forms of development to the area, and by the late 1950s, the U.S. administration of the colony was proud of their achievements, as Micronesian houses were improved, power boats were being bought, 500 cars were now on the island, 275 radios, as well as various other electronic equipment. And the large-scale adoption of technology by the Micronesians was seen as proof that U.S.-style economic development had worked in Micronesia, so much so that by the end of the 20th century, Micronesians consumed more than $60 of imported goods a year. But this progress came at a high cost, both for the colonial government as well as the local people of Micronesia. For the U.S. colonial administration, the growing economic and social integration of Micronesia into the larger global economy required a large outlay of cost, and there was significant increase in the amount of spending on administrative control throughout the late 20th century. And these large costs caused the United States to divest itself of the Micronesian colonies. By 1976, the North Mariana Islands had become U.S. territories, and by 1978, the Marshall Islands had become a constitutional republic. Yet despite its new independence, Micronesia has not returned to self-sufficiency, and instead has become more deeply ingrained in global economies. The area is still very much economically dependent on the United States for most of their resources, and the United States government still plays a powerful social, governmental, and military role in the region. Well, that's going to wrap up this discussion of Chapter 8 of Bodley, Economic Globalization. As always, if you have any questions about the materials or the assignments this week, please feel free to contact me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I'll see you next time.